Hello, I'm Lori Woodley Langendorf from All It Takes, here to bring you our November episode of Building Trusted Spaces, the Educator series, where we're going to speak with Graham Wiseman, Shine Khalifa, and Alejandra Valencia about the youth mental health crisis that we're seeing across our state and beyond, in schools, in hospitals, everywhere. The original thought, because we won't do another one of these until January, is that the holidays are not sunshine and happy moments for lots of people. And so we have this ever increasing mental health crisis, and I'll talk a bit about that. Student health crisis, mental health crisis, young people health crisis, you name it, the title is there. It has to do with educators and the students that they serve. And the common thread is mental health crisis, no matter who gets put in front of it. And so that even, this year is finally when some of the COVID statistics and research started to land. But those of us in the field already knew, like, we didn't need research to back up what we're living every day. Each of you in different positions, and I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves and why you said yes to come on this call, what you do to serve youth, that ultimately we look at our clients are the youth. So we might actually directly serve adults, but they're serving in their messaging the youth, our young people population who don't have both the resources and sometimes, depending on age, the right to actually seek some of their own support and help. And so we get to be there to support them directly and those who serve them. So each of you do that in different ways. And so I'd love to just offer the opportunity for you to introduce yourself, what you do now, what you've been, what led you to this moment to say yes to be here right now would be wonderful. So who would like to go first? Okay, Graham, you lit up.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm Graham Wiseman with BeingWell, California. We're a small nonprofit up in Northern California. And we kind of got started because, we each have different stories that drive us. And for me, the story that drives me revolves around losing our son, Colin, to suicide. He lost his battle with depression at 15, and a couple parents afterwards kind of asked how the school was on its supports, and I said not good. Those may not have been the words I actually used, but it wasn't good, and the middle school was even worse. So we kind of got together and thought, let's list all the things that we find are struggles or challenges in the schools, and then let's pick 3 that we can actually make a positive impact on. It took us 5 years, but we got wellness centers in all our high schools in the district. And then we went to the neighboring district and got 30 more in that district. So we realized, there is hope. They're like caring adults, the stuff that Lori talks about all the time, that caring adult can make such a huge difference. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been working on wellness centers, improving the ones that are in or helping seed ones that are starting. And then kind of on the sidelight, we work on a California mental health awareness license plate. Shameless plug right here. All right. Our goal is to bring mental health into the light, even if it's just a traffic light. And we're working on legislation and have been for a while now to get that passed. So that's kind of what brings us here today. I know from past experience that 3 adults, like-minded adults, could make a massive change in a school district and impact hundreds, if not thousands of kids.
Thank you, Graham. And thank you for, being willing to share your story. I don't know how long it took till you could share your story about Colin, and, the light that he was in your family and in the world now, right? So his light lives on forever in the work you're doing. So to Colin, all of our words, be in support of the journey he took and all the students who are in similar places as him and families. So thank you. Thank you. Shine or Alejandra?
I guess I'll go next. It's really nice to be in this space with all of you, and really honored just to be here and hearing, what you just said, Graham, really spoke right now. And it's the first, couple of minutes that I've been in a virtual space with you, right? And I think piggybacking on who I am and how I got here. My name is Alejandra Valencia. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. And what really led me here is I initially started as an outreach specialist with, I'm from Ventura County, working with our largest school district, and really being that support for parents and young people, which was my first introduction into youth development. Which is what I specifically specialize in the adolescent brain, and ensuring that there is that trusted adult, and in a very non-clinical approach, right? I think that's something that is very transformative as to oppose a very transactional communication, lens. And that really led me to the work in prevention and youth development, working with the families, and really providing that sense of support and eliminating those barriers for them to get access, especially with our most marginalized communities and populations. I think for them, it's having that access and that necessary space for them to be able to thrive in their, educational journey. It's not just the student that's being put in that educational journey, but also the adult. And I think, being there with the districts and supporting the districts, and really adding them to the table, right, and having them be part of that conversation, right. And I think that you just brought a really good point to that, being that person. And I think that's what led me to, working for the County Office of Education, and really honing in on comprehensive health, and working with our local youth development programs, that really at the county level, at the local level, providing that direct support, and really coaching adults to really incorporate youth development as a key component in when it comes to the work of prevention, how to facilitate those conversations. And that's SEL in a nutshell, right? It's really providing those tools for them to really succeed and be sustainable. And now the work that I do is very similar. And I now, work for a communications company that really works at the state level to incorporate messaging around wellness and prevention and overall comprehensive health, and what that messaging looks like from an equity lens, and just to build sustainable and shifting that narrative in reduction of stigma and mental health, and how it really affects just people, right? And I think that having that lens is extremely important, and building agency. So, with my background, I think that's what pretty much keeps the work going, and building agency with folks, and being in spaces, and transforming those conversations, right? So thank you.
Thank you. So
Wow.
well spoken. What you're doing, amazing, both of you.
And I was like, that's just amazing, just hearing your stories. That's so amazing to be a part of this space too, really echoing from what Alejandra said, just thankful for being here, but also, to hear your stories and how you've turned that to help the community, and such powerful things that you're doing. Just want to introduce myself. I'm Shine Khalifa. Haven't guessed already, I'm originally from England, and I think that's where things originated for me. I was very much raised in a household where community work and volunteer and helping people was very important. So I remember going as like a 13-year-old and reading to the people, the senior assisted living places, and as I went through school and went through some volunteering, like volunteering experiences, I worked with a lot of populations that really had struggles. I worked with some young adults who had severe learning disabilities or had mental health problems, and just helping them to just assimilate in society and just helping them with those different transitions. And that kind of took me down the road of education. I became a teacher and kind of continued to work in inner city schools, and eventually moved over here to California and became a teacher with the Westside Union School District. This district has my heart, and I came back, and I'd always thought I've always wanted to get into leadership, and I eventually moved into being a VP and now a principal, and I was often questioned, well, why, you got into teaching to teach students, and now you're going into administration. And if there's one thing that I've really learned is moving into this role has really enhanced that ability to I made powerful connections with kids before within my classroom community, but now I'm making really powerful connections with those most needy students on site, on campus. And that's just been so rewarding to me, to be able to really hone in with those students and help them with their emotional, social needs on campus and getting to where they need to be. All children come with a different set of backgrounds and social emotional experiences, and so just helping them to navigate those. And I come from a family where I'm in education, but my husband and all his family are in medicine, and some of the stories that I hear, and even before the pandemic, there was a lot of mental health, some very tragic cases. And a lot of that, I think, has come even more so after the pandemic. It's been very sad to see that the students have, and young adults and young children are having less and less access to things, but yet we have an increasing number of students who are suffering with those social, emotional, those mental health difficulties. And, I'm glad to see we're coming out of that pandemic and resources are opening back up for them, because I think that's one of the areas where we really saw a huge decline during the pandemic. So it's nice to be here, to be talking about those issues that we are all seeing, but it's also nice to know that things that we're moving out of that phase and we're starting to open things back up and get the supports for these students that they absolutely need, and these young people that absolutely need that. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you for being here, and just, listen to the three of you, somebody who's in the trenches on a school site. And I happen to know you're in a K-8 school site. So you've got the middle school and the babies, right? It's probably pre-K. Is it pre-K now?
Yeah, we have a UPK all the way through to 8th. Yeah,
so you're UPK to 8th grade. So you've got a range of students, and Graham at the state level, and, working with districts, and you, Alejandra, also like messaging to the state. So I feel like what we have here is broad experience and expert knowledge that I'd love to dive into from the perspective of why. So Shine, you spoke why, Graham, you spoke why, Alejandra, you spoke why. But when we get into each different, topic that you might want to bring up, or that I might, send out, like what is the experience you have around what you want to talk about, right? And so that might be like you all said something that I took notes. We have to go to there. We have to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, Graham, I have an a Heart AIT license plate. And as soon as that mental health one comes, we're going to move that same messaging onto a new plate. Can't wait for that to happen. One of the things that you said, Alejandra, going back to when you were sharing, that caught me was that you said something around in just a couple of minutes, you felt connected with this group of people who you had just met.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I instantly felt connected with, with what Graham mentioned and what he shared. And thank you for sharing that. I know it it takes time and to really put yourself out there, and not just yourself, but, really telling your story. I think when it comes to sharing, such a vulnerable part of yourself, it really, the way it resonated with me is that it really took me back to, that's how I initially started my career, was actually in the K-8 site. So, and I realized that I went in there for mostly intervention, right? And I went in there for intervention and really working with support staff in just providing a sense of level of intervention with students that, they were repeats, right? They were in this, the same students that were, the same students that were in the office, that were in the AP office, right? And I know Shine could maybe relate to that, right? So I started realizing, and at that time, that school had just transitioned into a K-8, and I don't even think they were a K-8 at the time. They started initially as a K-5, and they were up to a K-7. And I realized that all of these kids, they've been together since they were babies, since they were at the kindergarten level. And, the area that the area that school was located, very rural area, with very limited resources. And I had just come in and I was freshly out of college. And this was my first really exposure to not the lack of resources, but the level and the lack of promoting youth programming, right? They're running an elementary school site. I mean, they're running a middle school with elementary school resources. And if you are in education, you know that those are two very different worlds, and especially in youth development and the development of young people. And because when that first exposure to middle school, you have a sense of creating identity, and you have the opportunity to really gauge who you want to be, and you are more exposed into being more independent and having that opportunity. And I realized that me being in meetings about intervention over and over and over again felt like I was, coming to a dead end. And I was getting nowhere, and especially with parents, right? And I took a needs assessment, of a visual needs assessment of what needs to really happen here. And I have a small cohort of students that are just very eager, and they're hungry, and they have an appetite to really speak and really share what their wants are and what their needs are. And they may not be able to articulate it, whether they're not well, right? And it was very apparent, and visually they were pretty upset. Their behavior was just off the charts. And I started noticing the change in the way that their relationship with the adults at the school, and with administrators and with teachers. And there was such a disconnect. But they were just, a sense of frustration, that they weren't getting what other students were getting within that district. And like I said, they may not, and with students, they may not, be able to articulate that they're not well, right? And that they're going through a lot of stuff. And that in itself is trauma, right? That in itself is social trauma, interpersonal trauma, and a sense of frustration. And like I said, they may not be able to articulate it in a sense, but with students, it's all in the behavior, right? It's all in the behavior. And middle school, and this is why some folks, they steer away from middle school, and and it's very scary. And what resonated with Graham, and what spoke to me, is the wellness center, and having a space to really call your own, and really have students being able to just have a space to just vent, or if they're feeling some type of way, right? When we hear that someone's feeling some type of way, they may not be able to communicate that, but we pretty much know that it's just a way for when adults, right, with just in general, everybody, if they're feeling some type of way, everyone deserves a space to feel some type of way. And I think validating that and really validating young people into having a space, and when that space is not being provided, that is a recipe for of just, you know, a recipe for destruction. And that and what it does to a young person's mental health is deteriorating. And that's something that a lot of young people carry into adulthood, right? Because you have your environmental, you have your social, you have all of these different variables that with some people they don't know how to navigate that, and it's very scary. And it's a very scary place to be when you don't have that connection with adults, and with some, you know, having parents that, you know, that they're just not, you know, they're working all the time, and they don't realize, they don't know what they don't know, and that's also okay, right? And that's not their fault. It's just, you know, oftentimes with parents, you know, they do depend on the school to be able to provide that space. And I think when there's a level of disconnect, it really does cause a lot of harm, right? And for some people, you see the effects within your home, and unfortunately, for some, it's, you know, it's the closing of the options, right? And the closing of wanting to ask for help, because that's just not something that is that was ever aspired or implemented, which is why I think that's when I really got the first sense of youth development being just a key component in someone's social and emotional learning. So.
Yeah, thank you. Like, now I have a whole bigger list, Alejandra. Like, I'm going to ask, actually, Shine, I'm going to ask you to respond first. Graham, I know you have lots to say too. So, no, I just, you both have so much. But Shine, I want to just pick up what Alejandra just said. And, you know, you said the door, they shut the door. And I wonder if there's a lot of our kids, my experience is, and then I wonder your thoughts, that never open that door. They're not culturally, in their culture, in their families, they don't talk about these things, right? So it's not something that always gets shut down. So we have a cohort of kids who never had it to begin with. And then we have kids who do shut it down because there's nobody there for them.
My why is, before I became a mother myself, and as a teacher, I was always like, I love teaching, I love kids. And I was like, I would always want to do the best by every student that I came across. But when I became a mom, my whole perspective changed. And I was like, how can I help these parents and help these children? And what's my why? So my why changed, and my why changed to this. It changed to, what would I want the teacher of my child to do? What do I want my child's classroom to look like? What do I want my child's school to look like? How would I expect her principal to deal with this issue? So I now deal with it still as a parent. What would my expectation be as a parent? What do I want for my child? And I would want to, so I address issues using that. And that's my new change in my why. And that's really helped me. And I think it resonates really well with our community too. They see that genuine, that authentic, that authenticness. And it really, it's nice. It's validating for me, you know, because, you know, at the end of the day, when you go home, you're sometimes very tired and exhausted. But when you see those thankful parents, when you see those smile, when you're able to turn the frown to a smile, it really makes such a difference. And you know, we have this amazing counseling program here. It's really driven by Kristen Fry, one of our directors, and she has an amazing counseling program. We have our counselors go into every single classroom every single month to present a skill, a social emotional skill for students, and coping skills and different strategies, very grade specific. It goes all the way from UPK to 8th grade. And that has been really, really powerful. So they not only have access to the counselor, where the counselor goes in and works with them on a skill every month. For example, last month's was zones of proximity. Sometimes, there's a lot of different topics. Every month is a different topic. And that just not only makes the counselor visible to the students, but, it also provides those opportunities to help those children with those coping skills and with those strategies to be able to deal with mental health or social emotional learning. So, and they actually get together collaborative as a counselling team across the whole of our district. And they get together maybe every week or every other week, and they come up with lessons. So the lessons that we have here will be done at every single school site across our district. And they are amazing, really amazing. Sometimes it's, impulse control. Sometimes it's how to deal with friendships, how to deal with peers. And I was just at an AXA a breakfast meeting this very morning, and there was talk about the ever increasing roles that we're taking on as educators. Initially we were charged with educating students, and then we were charged with feeding them breakfast, and then we were charged with providing after school hours, and then we were charged with, I remember this was in England, I remember a parent coming to my reception teacher, my kindergarten teacher, and saying, when are you going to teach my child manners? There's that ever increasing, more and more duties on the educator and on the schools, and essentially, just as it was mentioned in this meeting this morning, the school is now the village. We've taken on so many more roles. And I like the fact that in our district at Westside Union, we have this amazing counselling program, which really addresses a lot of the things that you were seeing not happening, Alejandra, that we were seeing. So now we have academic counselling for kids who are failing in junior high. We have we contact parents, we request counselling consent so that students can connect with a counsellor as and when they need to. We provide students with hot passes when they need to be able to come to admin, to be able to go to this counsellor. So, and in addition to that, we have camper climate assistants. So it's 3 people that are not there just to supervise. They're there to do those regular check-ins with those tier 2, tier 3 students that need those emotional, social supports and guidance on how to engage and how to interact on campus, and just help them navigate those really difficult times, especially since coming back from COVID. And so we do things like lunch bunch activities where they have the opportunity to go and do crafts. And we had our junior high students, all the kids go out, they don't want to spend their lunchtime with some CCAs. So we have the CCAs out there, and they were making those, those new bracelets. And it's just a really amazing to see that you've got these 7th and 8th graders just to switch off and engage in an activity where they could just have fun and join in when they want and step out when they don't want to. And it's just amazing that we have that program in place. And it definitely is kudos to the director and our district for making sure that we are providing those extra supports to fill in those gaps and those needs for those high need students that need those.
Yeah, and I think, from where we were then to where, we are now, it's changed so much, right? Because I think, being at sites, right, when you're witnessing, firsthand the results of not having all of those things, right? It really validates why, advocacy is extremely important, right? And I think being an educator, right, there's, I remember someone told me, as an educator, you educate and you don't advocate. And I always questioned that. I was like, wait a minute. I'm like, well, if we educate folks on why these things are important and why students really need a counselor and a counseling team and activities and incentives to build that connection with school sites. That's going to create connection not only with adults, but also their immediate loved ones, right? And it really supports their development and their why, right? Why do I like going to school, and why is it extremely important? And I think, with COVID, it really amplified that. What a difference, right? And going back, to the missing pieces of that infrastructure, right? that I mentioned earlier, that like I said, it's just, you see what's missing and how to advocate for those things to really be put in place. So I think the advocacy piece is extremely important, and continuing to advocate for, social and emotional programs and youth advocacy and what youth and voice and their engagement and what that looks like for a healthy development, right?
Yeah.
And that educate, not advocate. Oh my goodness. I want to say educate and advocate.
Right. Yeah, I had never heard that before. Graham,
I had never.
Yeah, like it used to be, educators thought of themselves as educators, not advocators. And I hadn't heard that. I think that there's some really great slogan in there: educate and advocate, or educators are advocators. And if they're not doing their job. Graham, just in response to these two beautiful humans who obviously are, making big impact and where they are. But I'd like to ask you, we got there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of good things happening. But I know from where you sit, there's not enough good things happening yet. And you've got to be worried about that. Like we bump into each other here and there, and did recently get to meet you in person for the first time after a couple of years on Zooms. Just what are your thoughts on that? Like, what's missing?
There is kind of just going back a little further in that, looking at schools, supports that were in schools, the change. We referenced the change on what school responsibilities are. When I saw my school counselor once in my entire high school career, and that was, they looked at my grades and said, "You don't have good enough grades to go to college. I guess you're going to community college. Next."
Exactly.
And
that's exactly my experience with my school counselor. Exactly.
That was it. So when we look at what we have to be thankful and grateful for all the wonderful kids. I mean, when you started talking about having counselors go into classrooms once a month to talk to children, to give them the vocabulary, or let them know, hey, you're not the only one struggling with this. What an amazing, amazing change we've had and we've gone through. As we look at where our kids are, one of the things that I see as a risk, kind of, like a little risk, is when our kids come to school, they get dropped off by these caring and loving parents who, if they come back to campus an hour later, have to show an ID, prove that they're not on the National Register of Child Offenders. And then they talk through the bulletproof glass to somebody who can't hear them and isn't quite sure what they want them to accomplish. And so there's this struggle to communicate. I was recently touring a wellness center in East Contra Costa. I live in Contra Costa County. And we heard of their multi-year program on implementing the wellness center. And after we heard what they had done and saw the results, we asked, what was the parent input? There was none. In the 4 years from inception, planning, implementation, and then fulfillment, there was no parent input. And that really alarmed us because, these are somebody's little babies that are getting dropped off. Their most important and cherished thing in the world. And to not give them a voice, as in cutting the parents out, and think that was okay. How do you stop someone mid-sentence and go, whoa, what are you doing? Without sounding like you're criticizing what they've done. So that's really one of the challenges that we have is there's what we believe are three legs of mental health support. That's the educators, the students, because they support each other too, you know, and then the parents. And if we don't have all three, we have not built a stable platform. So there is a pushback in the state of Texas on wellness centers in which parents are saying, I don't care about all this SEL, LMNOP stuff. I just want my kid to get into Harvard. And they're like, well, that's the parent that really needs you know, help. But it's a loud voice and some people behind them and going, yeah, that's right. You know, so I think one of the things is as we get further along on especially implementing SEL in our schools and stuff, I would think if you stopped every other parent as they came by to drop off their child and asked them in 2 sentences or less to describe SEL, you get an interesting assortment, but very few of them actually understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so it seems foreign. And Shine, you may not know that I'm also an immigrant from England. I'm from Kingston on Thames, but
No way.
Yep. Moved around the globe a lot. My dad was a consulate with the United Nations. So
Wow.
always trying to blend in. But
Did you say Stoke-on-Trent?
No, Kingston on Thames.
Oh, not southerner, right?
Yeah. It's now all been absorbed into Greater London, but back then we were independent. But you know, Laura's question is kind of pointing to some of the scary statistics that are coming out about. Well, I quoted a study done a few years back, but they went to 377 countries and measured the suicide rate after a calamity. And those were earthquakes, flood, or fire. And so some of them were immediate, like after an earthquake, the next year, the suicide rate jumps about 60%. But the really scary one is the one that keeps mounting. So if we look at the pandemic from 1918, 1919 was not the peak of losing people, or 1920 or 1921. It was 1922. It was 4 years after the pandemic that the real impact was felt. And so that's one of the things that we in education, you know, people that are in the trenches, people that are, you know, working at county and state level are really have to keep aware of, is that we're not only out of the woods, we're just entering the woods. And it's important to understand that it's a dark, scary place. So giving those students the skills, the ability to communicate what they're really feeling is critical. Having parents who understand what the kids are saying is just as important. And surprisingly, I've been getting a lot of calls from districts asking us to come in and talk to their teachers, addressing, you know, teacher burnout, the staggering number of them that don't want to work there. I think LA Unified had 75% of the teachers said, yeah, I'd be happy to go somewhere else. That's really, you know, that kind of translates down to the students. They can feel that. Mm-hmm. So, you know, how do we keep things going? And, you know, kind of going back to that why, the why I constantly throwing an elbow and putting myself in meetings and getting, you know, invited or not to school board meetings and so forth, is that I go to school board meetings all the time and I am the only parent there. Because there's an assumption that the school is going to do good for their kids. We need to validate and continue that assumption and let parents know. So communication, I think, is something that's really been lacking for schools, to let parents know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how it works. Now, getting parents involved is not easy. And in fact, at my local high school, the one my kids went to, there was only 10 parents would show up 10 o'clock on the first Thursday of the month for the parent club meeting. There was no tea in that because there was no teachers. They're busy working. And what it did was it gave a parent voice of only those who were available to volunteer their time at 10 o'clock in the morning, and really skewed what was being taught, thought was, this is what the parents think. It was not what the parents think, but it was getting portrayed that way. And so when they were getting this, the wellness centers were going in and we're getting pushback, immediately recognized the issue was education of the parents and making sure that they understood what was going on. So it's, we've lost 4 kids in our district in the last 12 months. And there's only 4 high schools. And that's not the ones who've gone off to college that we've lost, just the ones I sat down with a parent the next day, and she was asking, what a lot of parents, why did this happen? Why did she feel she couldn't come to me? And there was this big, long, series of questions she had, all doing the same thing, why? And the real answer, and the one I really couldn't share, was that your daughter didn't want to let you down. She didn't want the idea of the perfect child to die with her. And then when we lost her, this was a kid taking 6 AP courses as a junior, editor of the school paper, captain of the lacrosse team, trying to get into Ivy League colleges. And an AP course, but what does AP stand for? Anybody help me out on that? What's AP stand for?
As a school counselor background, I should know that, but I didn't do high school. Is that a good enough excuse? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And my excuse is I did my high school in England, but it's advanced
Placement. Advanced placement.
You're
placement.
absolutely right.
Thank you.
Academic pressure. So these
I prefer that one.
It is, you're right. Oh, yeah.
these AP courses are intense. And there's a real push for kids to try and do that. I live in a relatively affluent area, and when the state was coming through, they were doing some question and answer time about mental health resources, a program they had collaboration between the Office of Ed, school districts, and county behavioral health. So the idea was to bring all 3 together to help provide services within a county. I pointed out to the decision-making team that even though in my local school district, 92% of the kids go on to 4-year college, our rates of suicide ideation and chronic depression were the same as they were for Alturas, which is way up north in Modoc County. So it didn't really tie in with, if you're tall or small, large or round, rich or poor, these pressures are there. And so I feel that in school districts where they measure achievement on how many kids are taking, 6 AP courses, that's a tricky one and I get a tremendous amount of pushback on, we need to limit those APs because you're adding so much pressure. And that's where they all are. All our kids are struggling with pressures from society, from home, from the future, what they're looking at. And then we add a liberal dose of pandemic onto that. And we're really looking at a tough time. There was a guy at the University of Colorado in Boulder came out with something called "What You Are is Where You Were When." And it is, it's actually a sales technique, but it is trying to guess someone's age. You just make a rough guess. And then you think, well, when they were 10, what was going on in the world? So if I use me as an example, when I was 10, we had the Arab oil embargo. The United States had just pulled out of Vietnam, and Richard Nixon had just resigned. We also founded the EPA because we got tired of breathing that beige air, that Los Angeles was famous for. What's that mean? That means as an adult, I don't count on commodities. People will say, Graham, why do you have 2 gallons of milk? There's no way you can drink 2 gallons of milk before it goes off. I know, but they might shut off the cows, right? It's not a logical thought process, but it is me compensating. I also, when a politician starts talking, I'm thinking, oh, it's Richard Nixon again. It affects how I listen to people speak on that. It also taught me that if there's a big enough challenge, you can make a difference. You know, when our rivers were catching fire and the birds were dropping out of the sky, we could make a difference. And that was really important. So now let's fast forward to what about kids who are 10 now? What are they going to think? How are they going to go through life? And it's up to us as people in their lives at this point to make more of those positives, like founding the EPA, than people being able to focus on the negatives, politics and stuff like that, that can really, you know, get someone down. That's kind of a percolating along in the back. And I know it's not something people think of right away, but we have an opportunity here to change the message as kids go home and have the parents more receptive to hearing that message of, you know what, I hurt my leg, but I also I'm not feeling all that good. And having just as much empathy and listening from the parents and support. And I say parents, I mean caregiver, grandparent, whoever that one is that's taking care of in their life.
There's so many questions that I could just jump from there. And Alejandra, I want to come to you to respond about your community. But before I come to you with that, a couple of things that I just want to speak to that feels like somewhat unanimous need, and all spoken differently between the three of you. But you all speak to conversation or community, right? Everybody's talked about whether it's going pretty well or it's not going well, or you see it as a need, or you see both. Some places it's doing well or some places it's doing not. Graham, you said something that I tied, like you've all mentioned SEL, and you know, not really understanding necessarily what that means. And I feel like it's really important in messaging that our families that we are communicating, and not in an article that goes home, like communicating in heart space, that SEL are skills that help our kids navigate really hard times and help them maybe reduce their chances of a mental health crisis. It's not an exact science, right? So we could, you know, we can explore resiliency and practice resiliency. And I want to say explore and practice because I'm a big believer that the worksheet's not enough. And Shine, you're talking about the thing of the month. And I hope all your classrooms, or as many as possible, are not just getting the lesson, but then practicing the skill and pointing out when the skill breaks down, and then pulling up our muscles and doing it some more, and that our teachers are practicing it also. Because so often in that SEL world, Graham, you said our adults, you're getting more and more asked to come and talk to adults. That's where we spend most of our time now. We were a direct service to youth. We spend a lot of our time with the adults now because they're falling apart. And there's this big wedge between wanting to be the educator and not the advocator. And it's hard to say that out loud because I want to believe that every teacher wants to be both, and they don't. But I really do believe that the reason they don't is because they don't know how, not because they don't want to. You're not in education if you don't care deeply about the kids. Like, I just cannot believe, no place in my being can believe that our teachers want to not be advocates, but they don't understand. So you spoke a lot about the parents not understanding and feeling welcome and understanding how to approach. I feel like our teachers and our classified, who are all part of the education ecosystem, don't have the skill set to know what it looks like to be a buffer for a child who's experiencing either a crisis or is pre-crisis. And that one person or 10 people, hopefully 10 people, can be the buffer on a school campus that prevents the crisis word from showing up. It's not going to prevent a depressive moment. It's not going to prevent an anxiety for some kids before a test, but it might prevent those things from becoming critical need. And I just feel so hopeful in the work we're doing with educators, but also more convicted because we think as management that they understand, and they don't. They don't understand the skill. We don't ask teachers to teach calculus if they haven't really learned math, but we're asking our teachers to be advocates. Like, that's such a great way to say it, right? And our custodians and our cafeteria workers and our office staff and our principals. And we have to actually have all of us step into that role, because there's not enough counselors to go around. There's not enough. So I wanted to have that.
I just wanted to add on that, one of the things that we're implementing, and this is probably our second year now, is capturing kids' hearts. So, I'm sure you've seen those viral videos that go around, and the teachers does an individual check-in with a student at the door, whether it's a fist bump or a high five, or that, the little dance, the shake that they do. So we actually have that implemented here on campus, and we're in year 2 of that. And our teachers all greet the students at the door, and we offered that training to a lot of our classified staff as well, and we're continually rolling that out, and so that's been very powerful. And I remember one of the statistics that when we were going through this program, it's like it just takes one person, one adult on campus to connect with a student, and that could sometimes be all that child needs, just to know that there's that one person on campus that they can go to should they need to. And so we've been really working with that, whether it's greeting the kids at the door, having a social contract in the classroom, starting off the morning with good things. So they share good things when they feel ready to, and then just, building that classroom community. So I think, educators, despite being burnt out at times, they are advocating for their students. We do have some amazing educators that definitely are doing both pieces. They're advocating and they're educating at the same time. And so, we definitely, I think, when you were talking about that, I just thought that's a program that really is there to support those students and just make connection with all kids on campus.
And the key is all, right?
Yeah, sometimes they need like hand holding on it.
Yes.
One of the things, you never know what you get drawn into. I'm on the post-vention team for the CDE when they have a suicide on campus, or, within a campus, a student or a teacher. They don't include parents in that, but, choose your battles. But one of the things that I learned very early was that people want to be told what to say. Not you need to, but here's how to. And that, there's a lot of experts, on suicide and post-vention intervention teams and so forth. And, I was watching the faces on Zoom, and finally I said, go into the classroom, say this, acknowledge the loss, let the kids talk, don't talk about means, don't go off on this. And they're like, that's what, we were an hour and a half into the meeting before we got to that. So, how does that work? So when I'm talking to teachers, I call it Mr. Oblivious. And so he's the new English teacher. Mr. Oblivious comes in, and the student comes up and says, oh, I've had this mental health challenge. And the first one is the first response is, hey, buck up. We all have challenges in life. The second, student comes up and it's, oh yeah, that's really bad. I had something just like that happen to me. And then they go off and make the story about them. The third response is to completely overreact. Let's pull the fire alarm, shut down the school. And then the fourth and final one is how to actually respond when a student says, I'm having this challenge. And that's landed pretty well. And, it's done with humor and trying to connect with people that way. But that's often what they need. When you talk about that caring adult sometimes people don't know how to share that. Mm-hmm. They don't know how to open up.
Yeah, and that's I want to ask Alejandra to share about your community and the community that you came out of. I know you're working not so much directly with students anymore, but when you were, and I know with the county, just to respond to what you're hearing, and then Graham, to come back to what you're saying, like the skill set. But I want to talk about vulnerability and the fear that our educators have around sharing and how that might diffuse their authority and their power, and our thoughts on that, because all the research
Yeah.
says it's the opposite, but we still struggle with getting teachers to feel comfortable with that. So Alejandra, would you like
Yeah.
to?
Yeah, definitely. And you just touched on something that I was already marinating about, the sense of, having that transactional relationship, right, as to opposed of a transformative one, right? And I think, and I think when it comes to, me being part of, early in my career, I was more in that direct service and really working with young people, especially middle school and high school, and then working in different community programs with different CBOs and working directly with behavioral health, and continuing to advocate for more, promotion of youth advocacy and youth programming and what it really does to a young person and their families. But piggybacking on what you were saying, Graham, is I was also part of, promoting Safe Talk and how to identify those invitations, and really promoting that. And I'll share something very, very brief. I had a friend who did unalive herself when I was in college, right? And I grew up with her, throughout my childhood, elementary, middle school. And, I was in college finishing up my last quarter. And, I got a call saying, have you spoken with my friend, right? And just for the family, I'll let's call her, Suzanne or something. So, just out of respect, but, and I said, no, I haven't spoken to her. But leading up to that, I had, different phone calls. There's a phone call and, I was just in college. I was just, doing my thing, right? Just living my life, right? Existing. So, time went on and, I finally got a call from, her sister, and they're like, have you spoken with Suzanne? And I said, well, no, I haven't. And then I just kept getting all the calls, and the next, that next day, it's like, oh, she jumped off the bridge. And I said, wow, okay. Well, I was not expecting that. And for me, I couldn't really figure out how I was feeling and grieving. And I know for people, grieving is just very different, right? It's not all across the board the same. And so, a few years later passed, and I was taking a Safe Talk training. And for those of you that are not familiar with Safe Talk, it's a suicide prevention training that really helps and identify signs of suicide and being comfortable with using the term suicide, right? And destigmatizing and being that support and being trained, right? And trained in Safe Talk. And as we were going through the workshop and identifying invitations and what to look out for, and if you see this, and this, chances are is that they're thinking about suicide and asking the direct question, are you thinking of suicide? And I thought about that moment. It took me back to that time. And all of those things happened, right? And the invitations were there. And if I would have known what I've known now about invitations and suicide prevention and how to relay that support and resources and be that, that guide or that person to seek support, and chances are is that someone giving out invitations, right, is because they want the help that they are not currently receiving. And that was it. And if somebody doesn't identify that, then that's it, right? So it took me a minute to connect the dots, but I connected them. And I feel like, if we have more folks that are trained in, the way that we have folks trained in CPR, right? Then we would be able to recognize the signs, right? And that's always something that I always think about whenever, I would do Safe Talk trainings and work with students and work with educators. and work with parents and really putting that out there, because when it comes to suicide doesn't discriminate whether you are in this tax bracket or this other tax bracket, or you come from certain communities. Some communities are affected differently, but when it comes to suicide doesn't discriminate. And does that mean that we should focus just on this population? No, it's all across the board. So I think, when you were talking about, being of how to react, and I think for a lot of folks, it's very, whether it's culturally or it's something that is just not spoken about. And I think you mentioned something like the different responses, like how to respond. And, we do this part where it's like, well, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? So things like that is just so, you're like, well, no, but you're allowed to not be okay. And the way that, folks view that really has a lot to do with it. And for those that really want that support and really want that, they're giving out those invitations that they want to be better and they want to feel better. But I think when it comes to, and I'm sorry, Lori, can you go ahead and remind me of the question?
No, you're speaking what you need to speak right now. You're fine. It's all good. And that, what you are responding to is exactly what we're hoping for on this conversation, that people.
And I think, going back to, I know that I'm not in the schools anymore, but I think when it comes to working with, with educators, it really needs to be more of a transformative relationship, and what does agency look like, right? And building on what folks think is a limited agency. And in a lot of cases, it does tend to be because, either the student doesn't know that they have their own agency, and the teacher, and there's all these hierarchical elements when it comes to education. And that's extremely unfortunate. And that's an infrastructure. Then I think if we come at it from a more, of a lens of being more transformative as to oppose of, more of a transactional, meaningless conversation, like with the glass. But chances are is that they were put because of, what's happening, right? And that's also unfortunate that, unfortunately, we can't have these transformative conversations because of other things that are, current events. And that's always so saddening, right? And it's always, how do you address these issues, or how do you address wanting to shift the narrative of equality and equity and build sustainability in someone's educational journey, and teachers, you just not feeling like they are valid in the work that they're doing. And I think it really should come from their own healing, right? They are suffering trauma as well, and it exists. And I think letting folks know that as a young person, you're allowed to exist. You're allowed to be here. Like, you deserve to exist, and you deserve this space, and this space is necessary. And oftentimes that space tends to get limited or eliminated, if in some cases.
Yeah, it does. And I would, if it's a good time, to respond to a couple things that you said that just really struck me. So Graham, you brought up, the schools that come in and with families and parents approaching, and with the vinyl plexiglass. And then Alejandra, you just spoke to the fact that he had brought that up. And I want to bring it back to that. And I try to look at this a little differently. At the beginning of this call, Alejandra, you said within just a couple minutes, you felt close and trusting of Graham, right? Graham shared something that was very real for him in a way that was truthful and authentic, and come from obviously a lot of healing, right, Graham? That, I don't know, healing is different for everyone. The journey is different, that through healing, we get to a place where we can talk about hard things from a more calm place. That doesn't mean, and I don't know if I'm jumping too far here, that the pain is always gone. I can't imagine that it is. Like, it's not, but we get to a place in healing where it can exist and we can live forward. And I just want to share that I think prior to the pandemic, nobody would have thought that we could have that kind of closeness on a Zoom call that fast. And I want to say that I ran groups with kids in masks where teachers are like, I can't see their faces. And it was like really all tense. And I'm like, but if I look at this child through these with eyes like this kid knows I'm here for them. Period. This child knows that I'm in connection with them. So we tend to minimize our possibility, in my opinion, of creating relationships because of circumstances instead of our relationships overcoming the circumstances. We're so often, the circumstances make us mad and we judge them and we don't like it. And that person doesn't like it. And I'm all warm and friendly, but I meet a school secretary who's like tired and frustrated and can't hear me. And so the approach I get back is not warm and fuzzy. And it's really just a reaction to her circumstances or his circumstances. But if we stepped into our adult SEL muscles and believed in our possibility of overcoming the circumstances because the relationships are more important, we could make some different decisions. I really think that we could. There's a lot of reason in the world right now to basically, hibernate, pull within, close everything out. So much pain, so many things we don't know how to do. I don't know how to answer that kid, Alejandra, who walks in the door and says, or Graham, I'm feeling suicidal. Call for the school psych, right? We got to train our families and our parents and our education system to be able to just say, wow, that sounds like it's a really hard thing to be feeling right now. We don't have to have the answers. We just have to have the willingness to learn. Like you said, Graham, they want to know what to say. But we have to be willing to learn what to say. And that's where I think part of our job is. And it's what I see my job like. How do we open the window to desired learning, to be able to be an advocate and advocate without needing to be a counselor or a school nurse or a principal? If I'm a teacher, I don't need to be those things. And I can still be really great at my connections with kids. And then Alejandra, you were talking about the teachers. Yes. But I want to say all of the school system, I read an article, or no, this is a tweet. This is just something I read that came across, and I'm going to read it. And it says, I noticed that our lovely janitor gets treated like an outcast. So I made sure to drink coffee with him daily in front of the gate. Today I was in a hurry to get to the office. He came to my office with a cup of coffee and awkwardly goes, thanks for being my friend. We're really in this together, relationally, and everything we do or don't do is impacting someone. And if we're impacting negatively someone who's another adult who impacts kids, then their impact with kids can't be as strong and loving because our impact on them was something other than strong and loving. So that's my riff there. In the pitch and the need for us to be really seeking understanding of the skill set to be better humans relationally with everyone, each of us on this call together as we leave the call. So there's what I wanted to add to that. I want to read from an article, the big study that was just done, and you may have seen it. CNN did a big thing on it yesterday. It's going to be a series. And this goes into, I'd love to hear from each of you, like if you had a couple of tips, especially going into the holidays. What do the adults who serve youth? That's every adult who serves. Let me try that again. That's every adult who serves youth. A piano teacher for 50 minutes, the AP teacher who's like driven to get those tests passed, the principal Shine who's like, hey, my office is a warm place, whether you blew it or you just want to share something, my office is a warm place. Alejandra, I think that the editing and the projects that you guys are creating right now to be messaging across the state, Graham, what you are doing is you're speaking to educators, all over. This quote at the end, towards the end of this article says, we really need to develop more of a strategy to help support all kids in different ways and really focus on some of those traumas and social influences of health. We need to make sure more children will have safe places to grow and thrive. For me, that's a yes, of course. But how do you do that? That's what I'd like you to respond to if you're willing. How do we do that? It seems so beautiful and kind of out there. What does a teacher do with those two sentences? Response?
I can take a stab. Shine, you look like you're going to speak.
I was just going to think about some of the measures that we have in place right now. We have, I can't talk to prior pandemic, but we do have lots of things in place to catch those, and I apologize. Oh, it was Alejandra that was saying those invites. We've got things in place that kids are sending us invites, and we're catching those invites. And that's simple district processes such as, we have a program that catches when a child just even types a word into a district device. That could be at home, it could be at school. When they're in their student portal, we will get then the stop it message to say this message, this child has typed this message, and we can jump on that straight away. And it's really talking to what Alejandra said earlier, sometimes kids are giving those invites, those invitations to, hey, I need help. And so we have those systems in place. And if they put something there, we can jump on that, we can get to that child and we can help them, and then do all of the risk assessments that are needed, inform parents and get them the supports that they need at that time. And I cannot begin to tell you how powerful that is and how many times we have to do that, but it's of such huge value. And I think it really helps. It really helps to get there and help those children in the moment right there and then. In addition to that, one of the things we do is it's educating not just the students but the teachers as well, and the staff. We have places where for example, a stop it, you're feeling bullied, you're feeling like something's not happening, not going well, or you just have an opportunity to anonymously report, but also just report and share your details as well. Another platform that we can use to then go ahead and target those kids immediately in that moment. And again, they might not be on campus, but we still have access to that information even when they're off campus. So those in-time supports are super, super powerful and really help to be, for us as not only a school site and a district, to be proactive and get those children, listen to those invites and get those children the supports that they need. And I think as much as I was having a conversation, like I would hate to have been growing up in today's society. I didn't have to deal with social media. It was just school interactions or out of school interactions. I think our students, our youth of today have to deal with a whole lot more that I don't know if I would have been emotionally and socially ready to deal with, that peer pressure and those pressures from social media. So I think having those proactive things in place where they can go and they can report, and sometimes they might just make a comment and we can jump on that and act on that. And we also do share that with staff and say, those are opportunities that, remind your students all the time that they can use those to advocate for themselves and to be able to say, hey, I need help, and it's okay. It's great to ask for that help. So, that's very valuable. I feel like having those supports in place helps us to be more proactive and help those students.
And that's what I was, hoping to hear. And Graham, you'll be next, like specific things. Those are great, beautiful sentences, but without actual practical tools, how do you do that? And that's the big question right now. Graham, thank you, Shine.
You're welcome.
Oh, I am off mute. All right. So, well, the basis for education is something that we're always trying to improve upon. And if you go back historically and you look at back in medieval times, when a king would educate their son, and it was the son, I know, but when the king would educate their son, the curriculum was logic, rhetoric, theology, Latin, and falconry. Now, there's not much cause for falconry right now, but Latin was a common language, a vocabulary that everybody could speak and understand. Rhetoric was the ability to take your thoughts and share them. Logic was pausing for a moment and thinking about what you're going to say rather than reacting, responding versus reacting. And then theology is better, belief in a greater power. So, even though that's 1,000 years ago, those are still kind of lessons that are important, that we have that ability to communicate what's going on. And how do you teach that? A lot of it is actually stepping someone through it. It's role playing that discussion. And it can be a 20-minute it could be a 20-minute talk to a parents club. It could be a 20-minute talk at a faculty meeting, or it could be a short in-class presentation. Sharing that commonality of hey, we all struggle, so nobody's feeling alone. We all struggle in different ways. And how do you share that, and how do you get help? Laura, you had asked the teachers, one of the reasons that they don't ask a kid how they're feeling is they don't know what to do if the kid says, yes, I am suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
That fear of the unknown stops them asking the question. Now, we have talked about suicide, and that, unfortunately, it's a reality. But if we back away a little bit from that and just understand that almost all those kids we lose are fighting depression. And some of them have anxiety. And a lot of this starts with stress. So if we walk a little further back from just having the conversation about suicide and having the conversation about stress management and how to center yourself, how to pull things in. And it is so different for everybody. We had a mindfulness exercise at a faculty meeting I was at, and the lady wanted us to close our eyes and focus on our breathing. I had a very traumatic injury when I was in my 20s, in which breathing, I almost died. And so for me to close my eyes and hold my breath became a traumatic event. And it taught me is what I may be saying, what I think is helpful. And I mean, who doesn't want to breathe in and then follow that up with breathing out? But even something like that can be traumatic. Right. And it's like, wow, even something that simple. So, it's being respectful, it's listening to the kids, and what Alejandra was saying about looking for those invitations. It is knowing what to say next. If you say, hey, have you thought about hurting yourself? And they say, yes, Mr. Oblivious would pull the fire alarm and panic. Or you can say, wow, do you know when, where you might do that? And that's that Columbia suicide severity training that comes out of Columbia University. 3 questions. If every teacher knew those 3 questions and then knew in their community, their environment, if a student says yes, yes, and yes, where to go right away. That alleviate, that starts the conversation right away. I had to chuckle a little bit when you were talking about, using technology to help on these kids. Sandy Hook Promise had they have a reporting thing that they put in. And after losing a girl, the students came to school and the school board, and they were very upset, and they wanted a separate meeting. So they got their separate meeting, and they were just sharing how they had seen some signs and didn't know what to do with it. And, the administrator's like, oh yeah, well, we've got this, this reporting software. All you have to do is anonymously go on there. And they go, oh, I'm not going to rat my friend out. So all the adults in the room are looking at each other going, oh, we've got a well-intended method, tool, and so forth, and they're not using it because we're not addressing their perception of what they're doing. You're not ratting your friend out, you're saving your friend. And until we can change that talk, that they actually stopped using the app because so few people used it, which is a shame. So, I really was enjoying the way you were describing the technology, Shine, and using that to not land on the kid, but just come back and say, hey, I noticed maybe you could do a little help. Yeah. So it's getting conversation back in there. My wife just retired after 33 years in front of the chalkboard, and her perception of what it meant to connect with a child is a lot different than today's perception. And so she knows that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, congratulations to her. I know I got to meet her and say that, but 33 years it's a beautiful journey of serving. Yeah. Thank you, Graham. Appreciate this, even the tips on how to speak, how to respond. I think it's really even okay to say, I don't really know what to say to you right now, but I want you to know I am right here with you, and we're going to move through this together. I think it's perfectly fine to say that. If you said something to me that was hard for you and I was genuine, it was like, I don't even know how to respond. And I just want you to know I'm right here to do this together. I mean, would that chase you away? Or would you feel like, okay, I don't know what we're doing either, but at least I feel safe doing it with this person.
And I think
Now someone's walking alongside you.
Yeah.
and
Alejandra?
I think, sorry, I just wanted to say, jumping off that, I think it's important to know protocols. Like, I know, for example, if the teacher is there, might not be able to help you, but here we have a protocol in place. So you shared that with me. I'm going to put you in touch with the next person that's going to be able to get you the supports that you need. And then there is that, specifically in my district, there is that the protocols in place should that child make a statement. So they're not just left hanging, and then they can get the supports that they need. So I think those are really, getting everything in place and having those protocols and following through with them, super important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think piggybacking on what both of you were mentioning, and Shine, you mentioned something that I was thinking, and it was about like the pressures haven't shifted from when we were all in middle school. They're the same exact ones. I mean, if you ask an adult, what were you scared of when you were in middle school? It's like fitting in, making friends, figuring out all these different, how to dress myself, identity, right? Those really haven't. If you ask a young person now, all those things are very similar, except the fact that now, like, let's say you got in a fight at school, or you're being teased, or you're being bullied, that actually goes home with you. And, there's social media, and it's, more amplified than it was when we were all in middle school. Right. And that, when you mentioned that completely resonated with me, because, I would do these activities with young people, and we would have the adults come in. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is, what can educators, and that includes everybody that works at a district, at the district level, at the site level, behavioral wellness, right? And incorporating all those different elements that do work with young people and families and communities. I think it's really important that, all of us have a sense of expertise in something. And I think really incorporating all of those elements, right, can really level up how the communication with folks around this time of the year really is going to impact them. And I think when it comes to this time of the year, a lot of adults get, stressed out, right? Whether it's, the holidays, and so do students and teachers and everyone that's involved in this ecosystem, right? And one thing that came to mind is really asking. And I know, there's parent groups, you have your ELACs, you have your school site council, and you have your different leadership groups. And I know it's very hard to get them all in one place, right? Your PTAs, et cetera. And you have, depending on, how big your school is or how little it is, or, where it lands on the, the county or whatever. I think it's really incorporating, voices. And around this time, incorporating voices could really create and shift that narrative of around the holidays. And it's like, what is it that you would like to see? What was it that you would like to see? And what can I do in my role to make that happen? Right. And including, those folks that are their first, face that they see in the morning, whether it's your admin assistants or your yard folks that are really, they have that firsthand experience with the student. And oftentimes they're the ones that hear what's going on. And I think incorporating them, or, if the district has busing or transportation, right? It's really incorporating. And I think it takes, leadership, those that are in that leadership, and really figuring out like, where can we all come in together and figure out, strategically and intentionally how this season is going to shape for following seasons and the seasons after that and the seasons after that. But at least everyone had something that they contributed to. And it's not just checking off boxes or et cetera, but it's more about, having them have their voice, because a student is going to have their expertise, their student, that's their expert, that they're an expert at this point. They know what they're feeling, and no one could take away that, no one could take away somebody's experience. Right. So I think incorporating an element, and those teachers will know which ones are their frequent, that they would really want to, hone in and have staff from different realms, especially if you're an administrator, you want your site to be tight. And you want it to incorporate all the pieces. And I think during the holidays that it can get really stressful and that added stress when you could all I think collaboration is key, right? Collaboration is key, and what can be done. And I think there is leverage when it comes to incorporating that message when it comes to the holidays, and what is it that the student wants to see, and tap into different leadership groups, or just even different groups that are on campus, and ask them, what is it that you want to see? Like, come, let's meet up. Let's do a quick powwow. I'll provide the space. There's a space that you all could come in, and that's building that trust. So when there's motivation for them to want to come back the following year, and the year after that, and the year after that, especially, at the K-8s, you're going to be with them. They're going to be there with you for a while. So start building them up. And that's, in youth development, we call it Hearts Ladder, and really adding them as a, that creates sustainability and engagement.
I love what you said, Alejandra. Thank you for your share there around collaboration. And Shine, you have a staff, right? You get to be the one in this group that has staff meetings. And, I wonder what it would be like to say for 10 minutes, whether there's one staff meeting before or through the holidays, or they want, 5, whatever, for 10 minutes, we're going to talk about what we can do to make sure we're reaching all kids during the holidays, those who want to celebrate big and are just like, just counting down the days, and those who it reminds them of somebody they lost and it's a sad time. And just like, let everybody be a part of the solution, because I agree with you around intelligence and being smart, Alejandra. We are smart together. And when we listen to each other, the most magical things come up, and whether it's out of kids' mouths or out of, our administration or just our team, and bring everybody in. How are we making sure our kids are good, not only through the holidays, but as they come right now? We are going to be dealing with some additional pressure on the top of research that says there is a mental health crisis. Thank you, Graham and Alejandra and Shine, for being with us today. And thank you, CalHOPE Schools Initiative, for being the funder to make this possible. for all of you and your amazing tips and your stories that are so heartfelt, serving our education system from the student to all of those who serve them. Wishing you, amazing holidays, whatever they be for you.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us tonight. And I look forward to crossing paths again many times. So I had to do that kind of little outro. I didn't do an intro, so Tanner captured that. He can put it wherever. And I just want to offer, if you need to go, that's great. If you have final thoughts, that's great. I just wanted to acknowledge that we're late, and I'm sorry for that. You're so captivating.
And thank you for the idea, because I wrote that down and we'll be doing that. We're actually in the process. I think I have to go buy a couple of turkeys of meeting some of our most needier kids. We definitely do like the big baskets for them for Thanksgiving, and at Christmas we do Valentine's, and we do Easter baskets, and that's really driven by our teachers. But it just got me thinking, just how to involve them. Last year, these kids I cried so much last Christmas. I just have to share this with you. I was like, we asked children, these most needy kids in our school, pick anything. What would you like for Christmas? And we were going to get them it. And we got one kid a bike and sneakers, and one kid, and I went home and I just cried. And it was like matching pajamas, and I can't still share that story without getting emotional. It's just so amazing. So thank you, Laurie, for sharing that, because I will spend the next few weeks spending 10 minutes thinking how is this part off air right now? It's not going to be shared. We just had a child who's lost her dad. How is that going to impact her over Christmas break? And so it's just so thank you for that tip. Is where I was going with that. And now I need to find
we'll make sure that a lost dad, but there are. I already spoke to that some of our kids have lost somebody, and that's the trigger, or that's a sad thing for them. So we don't have to share that specific piece, Shine, but your story around that and matching pajamas,
And seriously, matching pajamas is one thing that you want in the world. Wow, I would have thought most kids elaborate things I want a PSP. No kid asks for an electronic device like a BSB or a PlayStation or anything like that. It was things like matching pajamas, or and nothing elaborate, which I'm so surprised about. We got a drone, but even those are quite fairly inexpensive, right? And just amazing.
Even socks go a long way.
Yeah, toothbrushes. Just having.
And I think that when students or families feel support and loved and not helped, it's a very different thing, and it's a subtle nuance. It's a difference between a gentle meeting somebody in eye contact and staring at them. Helping feels insulting, and almost, for many people, especially certain cultures, right? But when people just feel loved and seen, then it's easier to accept support. I think it's a very different thing. Graham, you're nodding. Would you like to share anything?
So every year, Fresno sends out a little message to all school children in the county. And it goes home with them, then it's emailed to the parents. And it is how to deal with holiday stress. And, it's pretty simple stuff. And I can forward this to you, Laura, if you want to share it out. But it's plan ahead, it's talking about what's going to happen. Looking at the risk, what's like someone who's just lost a parent, or somebody's incarcerated, those are really traumatic times. It's the kids who feel left out that struggle perhaps the most. And then, helping those emotions and starting new traditions, new traditions. So, hey, you know what, we're going to go to Chinese food. What, we're going to break it up a little bit. And then just that it's normal, whatever they're experiencing is normal.
Yep. And it's perfectly fine, right? Like it's normal and it's acceptable. Yeah.
And then they follow that up with resources for parents, for educators, and for teens, because sometimes the parent is the problem, right? Sometimes the teen can't go, to someone close. So it's just giving him those outs. But I always thought that was a good thing to kind of set the tone of, yeah, it can be stressful, and, focus on the good. So focusing on the good, making that connection. It's always been, having moved so many times, we had so many different traditional holidays, we're like, you do what? A goat? And so it was just a different thing, but it really, whatever it was okay. It was okay. So that's all good. Laura, I want to thank you for getting us together and the work you do. This, a voice out there, people can click on it and hear that voice. I'm eager to see your TikToks. And I do want to see you dance once.
That might need wine.
Off the record.
Off the record, Tanner.
Yep.
Alejandra, Graham, thank you for joining us. and thank you for that appreciation. You both, three of you have given us almost 2 hours of your afternoon. And, Tanner and I'm like, I don't even know if we'll have a lot to say for an hour. He's like, you might go an hour and a half, and now we're even over that. So I know I got some final thoughts from Shine and Graham. Alejandra, do you have anything you'd like to close with?
I just, thank you for providing that space, the virtual space, right? And I know I'm not in a at the site level or even at the county office of education, but I think hearing shared experiences, I think it's something that even for my overall wellness, it feels good, right? It feels good to be able to be in spaces like this and share my experiences and really, it resonates with, a lot of the work that has led me to be in the position that I am right now, currently and presently, thinking about the holidays. And whenever I do think about the holidays, I actually do think about, working with my families that I would, frequent with and not necessarily helping them, right? But I think because they're part of the team, they're part of the team and being part of the healing process, and healing is nonlinear, right? And remembering when I would go and gather up all these gifts, right, and ask teachers and for support. And this is something that they didn't have to do, right? It was just something that an ask was just being put out on the table. And some of these parents didn't even know these teachers, that there were teachers that their students weren't even in that teacher's class. It was a whole different grade level, whatever. But I think seeing a familiar face and knowing knowing that someone cared enough to go ahead and do this, I think was also part of the reconnection with the school and the environment, and letting the parent know that, hey, we're here and we're part of the village, like Shine mentioned. This is the village, and for a lot of parents, the school is their first resource.
Yeah.
So, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. And if we don't cross paths prior, happy holidays, all of them, whatever one you celebrate.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays,
And stay connected to us, because we've got some kid and adult training programs coming up, funded fully by the state, so they will not cost anything. Except we have one that's in March. It'll be a 2-day train the trainer in building trusted spaces, all about this, For adults, free, just travel would have to be handled, but 2-day training at no cost. So yeah, so that's one. And then a youth and adult program where we're going to bring some middle school 8th graders to 10th graders with adults from school, train separate, come and share, train separate, come and share. How do we start talking with each other, listening to each other from a place of desire to understand and move forward rather than to, for the split wedges. So some things coming up that'll be really great. And thank you to CalHOPE Schools Initiative for making all of this possible.
Go CalHOPE.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, team. Have a great day and happy holidays.